picture this. You walk into a psychiatric clinic in London, right? You sit down with a therapist, you detail your history, your daily struggles, all of it.
Yeah, standard intake.
Right. And at the end of that session, the clinician hands you a diagnosis. They say you have complex PTSD or C-PTSD.
Okay.
But then let's say you get on a plane to New York, you walk into an American clinic, sit down with a totally different therapist, and you present the exact same symptoms, word for word.
The exact same history.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But officially, according to the American Diagnostic Manual, that condition just, well, it simply does not exist. You actually cannot be diagnosed with C-PTSD in the United States.
It's wild. It's the exact same set of symptoms, but, an entirely different reality on paper.
It is. And getting to the bottom of this geographic split, that's our mission for this deep dive today.
It remains one of the most perplexing paradoxes in modern clinical psychology, honestly.
Yeah, because we have a huge stack of clinical history, diagnostic manuals, and research notes to get through. And we want to understand this really crucial distinction in mental health. Basically, how prolonged, repeated trauma reshapes the human mind entirely differently than a single traumatic event.
Right, because you have the World Health Organization publishing the International Manual saying this syndrome absolutely deserves its own distinct clinical category.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have the American Psychiatric Association's DSM-5 flatly refusing to recognize it as a standalone condition.
Which is just wild when you think about the real human beings caught in the middle of that debate, So to frame this whole concept for you listening, think about it like this. If standard PTSD is the psychological aftermath of a sudden earthquake.
Like a massive, terrifying single event.
Exactly. Then complex PTSD is what happens when you live in a house that is slowly, imperceptibly sinking into the ground for years.
What's fascinating here is that to understand that sinking house, and why the diagnostic world is so fractured over it, we have to rewind. We have to look at how psychiatry defined the word trauma in the first place.
Right.
And more importantly, we have to look at who was completely left out of that original definition.
Yeah, let's start with that origin story. Because when we talk about standard PTSD, we are generally talking about a framework that was codified in the late 20th century.
Yes, so post-traumatic stress disorder officially entered the American Diagnostic Manual, the DSM-3, in 1980.
1980, okay.
And the push to get it in there was heavily driven by the aftermath of the Vietnam War. I mean, psychiatrists were seeing thousands of combat veterans returning with severe psychological distress.
So it was very much tied to combat.
Combat, yes, but the criteria were also built around survivors of other massive catastrophic events, like think of a plane crash, a severe car accident, a rape, or a natural disaster like a hurricane.
And the unifying feature of all those examples is that they are discrete events, right? Like they have a clear beginning, a middle, and an end.
Exactly. The hurricane eventually stops, the combat tour ends, and you go home.
Right. So the model basically assumed that trauma was something that interrupted your normal life. And after the threat was physically gone, your psychological task was to process and recover from that specific memory.
Yeah, the field built an entire therapeutic architecture around this idea of the aftermath.
But then something changed.
Right. In 1992, a psychiatrist at Harvard Medical School named Judith Herman introduced a massive breakthrough. She published a paper, which later became her landmark book, Trauma and Recovery.
A hugely important book.
Absolutely. And in it, she essentially coined the term complex PTSD. See, Herman wasn't treating combat veterans. She was working primarily with incest survivors and survivors of chronic domestic violence.
So for the people in her clinic, the trauma hadn't been a single incident on a battlefield or a car crash. It had been their everyday reality for years, often starting in early childhood. And crucially, it was usually being inflicted by the very person the victim depended on for their literal survival.
Right. Herman started comparing her case notes with colleagues who were treating completely different populations, like prisoners of war, hostages,
Wow.
concentration camp survivors, and people who had escaped religious cults. And she realized the common thread across all these seemingly different groups wasn't just the extreme danger they faced.
So what was it?
The active ingredient was captivity.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because the essential variable here isn't just the severity of the trauma, right? Like how violent or terrifying it is. It's the inability to escape.
Exactly. It's about being trapped.
I mean, if standard PTSD is about a nervous system trying to avoid a tiger that attacked you once in the jungle, complex PTSD is what happens when you are forced to live in the cage with the tiger every single day because that tiger is also the entity feeding you.
That is the perfect analogy. Because when a single terrible thing happens, like a tiger attack, a healthy nervous system's standard coping strategy is avoidance.
Right, you run away.
You run away, you hide, and going forward, you stay away from jungles that remind you of the event. But consider a child who is entirely dependent on an abusive caregiver. They simply cannot use the standard coping mechanism of avoidance.
Because if a toddler runs away from home, they freeze to death or starve.
Right. They physically cannot survive without the person who is terrorizing them.
Yeah.
They must stay attached to their abuser.
God, that's dark.
It is. So, to survive in that cage, the mind is forced into a much deeper, much more profound reorganization of identity, emotion, and trust.
You can't change your environment, so you have to adapt your own internal architecture to the captivity.
Exactly.
So if the root cause is this inescapable captivity, how does the resulting psychology actually look different on a daily basis? Like, what are the symptoms of a mind that has adapted to the cage?
Well, we can break it down into pillars. Complex PTSD, as it's defined by the World Health Organization's ICD-11 manual today, actually starts with the 3 core pillars of standard PTSD.
Okay, what are those again?
First, you have intrusive re-experiencing, which means flashbacks or severe nightmares.
Right.
Second, you have avoidance of internal or external reminders of the trauma. And third, you have a nervous system stuck in a constant threat mode, creating intense hypervigilance and an exaggerated startle response.
Okay, so looking through the criteria in our sources, I see those 3 standard pillars. But for complex PTSD, they stack 3 completely new pillars on top.
Yes. The manual calls these additions disturbances in self-organization, or DSO.
DSO, got it.
And those 3 extra pillars are really the hallmark of the prolonged adaptation. So the first is severe dysregulation of emotions.
Meaning what exactly?
A person's emotional baseline is shattered. They can swing wildly from total dissociated numbness to explosive, unmanageable rage with very little warning. The nervous system simply cannot find a middle gear.
And then the second addition is relational disturbance, because the sources describe this as a lasting, profound difficulty sustaining relationships or feeling safe with other human beings.
Right. It often looks like a pendulum swing between total isolation, like pushing everyone away to stay safe, and desperate over-attachment to anyone who shows a hint of kindness.
Which brings us to the third addition, and arguably the most defining feature, which is a persistent negative self-concept.
Yes, this is a huge one.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because looking through the source material, there's a huge misconception we need to clear up for everyone. When people hear complex PTSD, they often just assume it means PTSD, but worse.
Yeah, that's a very common misunderstanding.
Right, and when they hear negative self-concept, they just think it means having low self-esteem or feeling sad. But the literature describes it as an ontological flaw.
Ontological, yeah.
Wait, ontological. That's a heavy philosophical word. You don't just mean they feel bad about themselves, you mean they believe their very existence is a mistake.
Yes. It is immensely deeper than low self-esteem. It is an unshakable, deeply ingrained belief of being worthless, defeated, permanently contaminated, or fundamentally damaged at your core.
Wow.
It is an identity forged in the belief that you are the reason the trauma happened in the first place.
You know, going back to the cage analogy, that actually makes terrifying sense.
How so?
Well, if the tiger is the one feeding you, it's psychologically safer for a child's developing brain to believe, I am inherently bad and I deserve to be attacked, rather than accepting the reality, which is, my only source of survival is a monster and I am completely helpless.
That's exactly it. Blaming yourself gives you a false sense of control in a completely uncontrollable situation.
It's so tragic.
Tragic, but brilliant. It's a survival mechanism. If you are the problem, then maybe, just maybe, if you can fix yourself, if you can be good enough or quiet enough, you can stop the abuse.
And you just carry that core belief of being defective into adulthood long after you've left the cage. So Herman named this dynamic in 1992, but she was actually giving a unifying name to a phenomenon that researchers had been circling for decades, right, in other captive populations.
Oh, absolutely. There were massive historical precursors to her work. Like, as early as the 1950s and 60s, researchers were studying the psychological aftermath of Holocaust survivors.
Right, from the concentration camps?
Yeah. A psychiatrist named William Nederland actually coined the term survivor syndrome in 1968, while Scandinavian researchers were documenting what they called KZ syndrome.
And they weren't just seeing flashbacks. They were documenting chronic treatment-resistant depression, severe social withdrawal, and this pervasive, corrosive mistrust of the world that persisted for decades after liberation.
Exactly. Then jump to 1979, the psychologist Lenore Walker published her groundbreaking work on battered woman syndrome.
Okay.
She detailed the psychological entrapment inherent in domestic violence cycles. She documented how the cycle of tension building, acute violence, and the honeymoon phase deeply impaired a woman's ability to leave.
Because it fueled immense self-blame and created constant, exhausting hypervigilance.
Right. And none of these earlier researchers used the exact phrase complex PTSD, but they were all describing the exact same syndrome of inescapable captivity.
They were all describing the same cage. But the turning point that takes this from isolated clinical observations to, like, undeniable biological reality is the ACE study, isn't it?
Yes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is the epidemiological backbone of everything we understand about prolonged trauma today.
Conducted by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC in the mid-90s, right? This was a massive undertaking.
Huge. They surveyed over 17,000 adult patients.
17,000. And they weren't just asking about physical or sexual abuse. They categorized household dysfunction, like having a parent with mental illness, substance abuse in the home, or emotional neglect.
And what they found completely disrupted how we view public health. They discovered a clear dose-response relationship.
Meaning what?
Meaning, the higher the dose of childhood adversity someone accumulated, the higher their risk became in adulthood for severe outcomes. And we aren't just talking about psychological issues like depression or a higher likelihood of substance abuse.
Right.
The data showed a direct link to severe chronic physical illnesses, heart disease, cancer, autoimmune disorders, early death.
That is just... So how does that actually work? How does a chaotic household at age 7 translate to heart disease at age 50?
It comes down to how a nervous system develops when it's under constant siege. When a child is trapped in a highly stressful environment, their body is constantly flooding with stress hormones, particularly cortisol, to keep them alert to danger.
So they're always on edge.
Exactly. The HPA axis, which is the body's central stress response system, it just gets stuck in the on position.
And when you have that much cortisol washing over a developing brain year after year, I mean, it literally changes the physical architecture of the brain.
It really does. The amygdala, which is the brain's fear and threat detection center, becomes hyperreactive and enlarged.
While other parts shrink.
Well, the prefrontal cortex, which governs logic, impulse control, and emotional regulation, is often underdeveloped. Because the brain is optimizing for immediate survival at the expense of long-term emotional regulation.
And that chronic stress response spills over into the rest of the body, right? You have constant low-grade inflammation.
Yeah, and over decades, that chronic inflammation wears down the immune system and damages blood vessels.
Which is the direct mechanical pathway to autoimmune diseases and cardiovascular issues. I mean, the body literally keeps the score.
The physical toll is undeniable.
So let me just pause here. Because we have decades of clinical history from Holocaust survivors and domestic violence victims, we have a massive CDC study proving that inescapable trauma physically alters the brain and the immune system. We have the World Health Organization recognizing it.
Right.
Why on earth does the American Diagnostic Manual, the DSM, stubbornly refuse to recognize complex PTSD? What are they so afraid of?
The rejections have been remarkably consistent over the decades, actually. When the American Psychiatric Association was drafting the DSM-IV in the 1990s, they actually ran a large, comprehensive field trial for a nearly identical proposed diagnosis.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was called Desno's Disorders of Extreme Stress, not otherwise specified.
Okay, that's a terrible acronym, but clearly targeting this exact phenomenon.
Very clunky, yes. And the field trial data actually supported the idea that survivors of chronic early-onset trauma showed a distinct symptom pattern compared to survivors of single events.
So they had the proof.
They did, but the committee ultimately decided the evidence wasn't strong enough to justify an entirely new, separate category. They just folded a few of the symptoms into the associated features of ordinary PTSD and moved on.
And then they rejected it again during the massive revisions for the DSM-5 in 2013, right? And they also rejected Bessel van der Kolk's parallel proposal for children called developmental trauma disorder.
Yeah, they rejected both. For the DSM-5, the committee tried to compromise a bit. They added a dissociative subtype of PTSD, acknowledging that some trauma survivors detach from reality.
But no standalone C-PTSD?
No, they flatly refused to create a standalone diagnosis for it. And the elephant in the room driving that hesitation, the most heated clinical debate in the entire field centers around borderline personality disorder.
Okay, BPD. I have to play devil's advocate here because looking at the sources, I can actually see why the DSM committee pushed back.
Go for it.
Let's look at those three extra pillars of CPTSD again. Severe emotional dysregulation, an intense fear of abandonment driving chaotic relationships, and a negative self-concept. I hate to say it, but isn't that just a textbook description of borderline personality disorder?
That is the central, forceful argument of the critics.
Like, why do we need a whole new label if BPD already describes this exact behavior?
They argue that creating CPTSD just muddies the waters because the overlap with BPD is so immense. But researchers advocating for CPTSD, particularly Marilyn Cloyter, have drawn a crucial dividing line between the two.
Okay, what's the line?
It comes down to that ontological flaw we discussed earlier, the self-image.
How does the self-image differ?
In borderline personality disorder, a patient's self-image fluctuates wildly and rapidly. A person with BPD might swing from feeling completely idealized, like they are brilliant and can conquer the world, to feeling utterly devalued and worthless in the span of a single afternoon.
Oh, so it's a roller coaster. Their sense of self is highly unstable.
Extremely unstable, whereas in complex PTSD,
Let me guess, it's static.
yes, the negative self-image is stable. It is monotonously, persistently negative. There are no idealized swings. You always believe you are fundamentally contaminated.
Wow.
Furthermore, the relational disturbances differ. Someone with BPD might frantically try to avoid abandonment through intense, sometimes manipulative attachment.
And CPTSD.
Someone with CPTSD is much more likely to withdraw completely and avoid relationships entirely because they believe they are too damaged to be loved.
That is a fascinating distinction. So the academic debate is whether that nuanced distinction, fluctuating versus stable self-image, actually holds up cleanly when you are diagnosing real complex human beings in a busy clinic.
Exactly. And the DSM committee argues the line is just too blurry.
But the real-world stakes here are massive for people. This isn't just an academic debate about paperwork. Borderline personality disorder carries a huge historical stigma in the medical community.
Oh, absolutely.
Patients with a BPD label are often unfairly viewed by doctors as difficult, manipulative, or untreatable. And we also know BPD is diagnosed disproportionately in women, which raises serious documented questions in the literature about systemic gender bias and how we label female anger and distress.
Getting diagnosed with CPTSD versus BPD completely changes a person's trajectory. It changes the type of specialized therapy they are offered, how much patience a medical team extends to them, and fundamentally, how they view themselves.
Yeah, it's the profound difference between a doctor telling you your underlying personality is disordered versus telling you your nervous system made a brilliant, necessary adaptation to survive a prolonged injury.
Which brings us to why this framework matters so much today, far beyond the therapist's office. Complex PTSD is the bedrock of what we now call trauma-informed care.
Right, and trauma-informed care is completely reshaping our institutions.
It really is. It's changing how we run schools, how we train police and prison staff, and how we handle refugee services. It shifts the fundamental questions society asks people.
From what to what?
Instead of looking at a student's chaotic, defensive, or disruptive behavior and asking, "What's wrong with you?" the question becomes, "What happened to you?"
I love that. It reframes the chaos. It says, your behavior isn't a malfunction. It's a survival strategy that worked in a previous dangerous environment, even if it's causing you problems here in math class.
Which is incredibly validating.
Extremely validating. But this mainstreaming of trauma concepts has introduced a modern complication, hasn't it?
It definitely has.
So what does this all mean for us right now living on our phones? Because since the 2020s, CPTSD has become a massive viral self-diagnosis trend on TikTok, Instagram, and Reddit.
Oh, everywhere.
Every day there's a new infographic explaining how your perfectionism or your procrastination is actually a trauma response.
This raises an important question about diagnostic dilution. On one hand, public awareness and self-recognition are empowering. Finding a word for your pain, especially one that removes the shame and blame, is a huge relief for people who have suffered in silence.
Sure, validation is good.
But clinicians are increasingly worried about how loosely the term is being applied online. The clinical threshold for complex PTSD specifically requires prolonged, repeated, inescapable trauma.
We're talking about the captivity element again, the tiger cage.
Exactly. But on social media, the algorithmic nature of therapy speak often strips away that nuance. You see the label being applied to ordinary, difficult childhoods, a bad breakup, minor family conflicts, or just generically stressful corporate workplaces.
And a bad boss is not a tiger cage. You can quit a bad job. A toddler cannot quit their family.
Right. A toxic workplace or a difficult upbringing is highly stressful, and it is entirely valid to seek therapy to work through it.
Of course.
But it is not the ontological shattering of identity that Judith Herman described. The danger here is that loose popular usage risks diluting a highly specific, clinically meaningful category into a vague lifestyle label.
Yeah, if absolutely everything is classified as complex trauma, then the term loses its power to describe the truly inescapable horrors it was designed for.
Exactly.
Well, let's synthesize this journey for everyone listening. We started with the limitations of the Vietnam-era PTSD model, which only looked at single, discrete events.
Right, the earthquakes.
Then we followed Judith Herman's realization that captivity, being trapped with the source of your fear, forces a developing mind into a completely different psychological adaptation. We looked at the biological proof in the ACE study, detailing how chronic cortisol physically reshapes the brain and body.
The sinking house.
Yeah. And then we navigated the fierce ongoing debates with the DSM and borderline personality disorder, all the way to the complicated algorithms of modern social media.
It is a remarkable evolution of how we understand the limits and the resilience of the human mind.
It really is, and that's exactly why this deep dive matters to you, whether you're navigating your own history, trying to understand the sudden, intense reactions of a partner or a loved one, or just trying to be a more empathetic, informed participant in society. Understanding complex PTSD shifts our entire perspective on human behavior.
Yes.
It proves that what looks like a character flaw or a broken personality is very often a desperately resilient adaptation to an impossible environment.
I want to leave you with one final lingering concept to mull over on your own.
Okay, what is it?
If complex PTSD is essentially the mind's brilliant, necessary adaptation to survive an inescapable cage, what happens when a survivor finally escapes into a safe environment?
Oh, wow. That is the real challenge, isn't it? The brain doesn't just switch off those defenses because the address changed.
No, it doesn't. Consider the profound, lifelong challenge of asking a nervous system to unlearn the very survival mechanisms that kept it alive in the dark.
Yeah.
The house may have stopped sinking years ago, but convincing the mind and the body that the ground is finally solid, that is the work of a lifetime.